Hello again, and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346. Today we're going to be talking about the goals of social psychological research. So when we talk about research, especially within social psychology, we want to primarily answer three questions. That is, what, when, and why. What do people do? When do they do it? And why do they do it? And additionally, to answer these questions, we want to focus on describing behavior, predicting behavior, and then explaining behavior. So let's first focus on describing behavior. So when we describe behavior, one of the easiest ways to describe behavior is to just observe people. Uncover possible patterns of behavior that we see people do, especially when interacting with others. The easiest way of doing this is through descriptive methods. One of the most common descriptive methods is an observational method. That's simply observing people behaving as they would. Sometimes we can do this in a real-world setting, observing people in their natural habitat, so to speak, or we can bring people into the lab and observe them in a more controlled and contrived settings. And this is description at its most basic level. For the most part, observations have pretty high flexibility. We don't necessarily need to have any specific hypotheses going in. We can just observe people and then take note of some of the behaviors of interest that we might see. But oftentimes there's not a lot of control. When we talk about wanting to explain behaviors, well, we can't really make that leap with observational research because we haven't controlled for other possible influences. We're just basically looking at people in different situations and seeing patterns. A different type of descriptive method is a case study method. This focuses on one specific individual in an in-depth form of research. And this is often conducted when, say, one person encounters an event or situation that maybe not very many people encounter, and they encounter a situation in which researchers cannot actually experimentally manipulate. So a great example of this would be Phineas Gage, who had a railroad spike driven through his skull, through his brain, yet he managed to survive, and he saw a lot of personality changes as a result. If we wanted to examine how he interacted with other people, we would conduct a case study. We can't necessarily experimentally manipulate whether or not someone gets a railroad spike driven through their head, obviously. Lastly, we can conduct a more survey method orientation for a more descriptive method. Surveys do apply to the second point I'm going to be talking about, but in terms of descriptive methods, they focus more on just asking people questions and having them respond naturally, and then using those responses to try and determine patterns of thought, patterns of feelings, or patterns of intended behaviors in the future. So that's describing behaviors. What about predicting behaviors? Well, when we want to predict behaviors, basically what we want to do is to identify factors that coincide with certain emotions, certain feelings, certain cognitions, or certain behaviors. And to do that, we use relational methods. So one of the most common relational methods is the correlational method. That just basically assesses relationships between two different variables, between two different constructs of interest. So we would possibly examine the relationship between smoking and cancer if we thought there might be a relationship between the two. If we want to predict the instances of suicide, we may examine depression and see if there's a relationship there. But although there may be causal relationships there, that one might cause the other, that smoking might cause cancer, or that depression might lead to suicide, not all correlations are causal relationships. So for example, a real correlation exists between ice cream sales and the number of murders committed. Hopefully, it's not the case that eating ice cream leads to you wanting to murder someone. Sometimes it might, but hopefully it doesn't always occur. It's more likely the case that there's another variable that coincides with both of these instances that can explain this relationship. So, for example, we might see that people eat more ice cream when it's hotter outside, and research suggests that we tend to see that people act more aggressive and may subsequently murder more people also when it's warmer outside. So there's a correlation between these two, but there's no causal relationship. Another type of relational method is a quasi-experimental method. This is an experimental method, but when we're comparing two groups that we cannot experimentally manipulate. So for example, if we're interested in the differences between men and women in math ability, we cannot randomly assign people to either be a man or a woman. They are who they are. We just have to deal with the fact that that random assignment cannot occur. You can think of nationality as another grouping that cannot be randomly assigned. So we examine things in experimental ways, but because we cannot randomly assign people to groups, this is not true experimentation. It's more relational methods. Lastly, we have experimental design, looking to explain behavior, looking to determine the causes of specific feelings, thoughts, or behaviors. So with experimental design, we want to manipulate one variable and determine if that manipulation has an influence on our variable of interest. So we manipulate an independent variable, or an IV, to determine differences in the dependent variable, or DV. And we can have different levels of an independent variable. So we may be interested in the differences between emotions and how that might influence performance on a math exam. So we might have one group who we have be happy, another group sad, and a different group angry, and we can compare scores on this math exam between different groups. We want to randomly assign people to these different emotions, as that is what true experimentation is. Ideally, we want to manipulate the independent variable, but we want to control the research situation or the research environment as much as possible. We only want to manipulate this one variable. Sometimes that can involve us using a laboratory and kind of taking the experiment away from more real-world settings where we don't have as much control. Sometimes, especially if we're interested in manipulating emotions, we can give people a baseline emotional video to put all of them at the same level of emotion and then manipulate emotions from there. So ideally, in experimentation, we want to control the research environment as much as possible. There are some issues with true experimentation. For example, people aren't always truthful in how they respond to questionnaires, for example. People often just won't do what they're told, especially in a more contrived or controlled situation. And labs aren't always like real life. People will behave in specific ways in laboratories, and then they won't behave in that way in real life. So sometimes it can be difficult to, maybe if you find a relationship between variables in a lab setting, to say that, hey, this is how it works in real life, when you haven't actually tested it. Additionally, a lot of the research conducted, especially within social psychology, is conducted at universities using weird participants. And what do I mean by weird participants? Well, the participants are more often than not white, educated, industrialized, rich, and Democrat. Obviously, this is not an appropriate representation of all the people who live in the United States, let alone the entire world, so a grain of salt needs to be taken with a lot of the research that's conducted. This doesn't mean that you can't conduct research. It just means that after you do conduct research, you should probably try and replicate these effects in a more varied or diverse population. And this reiterates the point that the findings of a single study should not signal an absolute truth. We need to replicate these findings. There could be other extraneous variables or variables that we are not thinking of that could be influencing the findings of the specific experiment that we conduct. So we need to replicate our findings. We need to maybe conduct our findings in the real world or using a different population to see if the phenomenon or the relationship that we might have found applies to different situations. And for this reason, theories are constantly changing or constantly in flux. If we can think about the same situation in a completely different way, we need to. The sun does no longer revolve around the earth. So we need to remember that what we might think to be an absolute truth might not be. We need to keep that in mind. And that's a good thing for all of you to keep in mind when we talk about some of the psychological research. You may have a completely different viewpoint, a completely different interpretation of these findings, and they can be completely valid. And that might lead to new research that needs to be conducted in the future. So that's all we have for today. Thank you for your time and attention. I will see you next time.